Okay, Shinun Hey discusses three topics. Balconies, which is gazuztras, the ships, and by extension, bathrooms. When it's also discussed in a different Siman, but it's discussed here also. And then I'm going to go into the topic of bridges, which is not relevant to the Siman, but somewhat connected, so therefore I'm going to discuss it now. So in Seif Aleph, the Alter Rebbe begins at the balcony, which goes out of the house. So it has, we're talking about a balcony which has no walls around it. It's a straight balcony out, and it sits on top of the water, so it looks like a dock for all practical purposes. Then you're not allowed to take water from the river or the sea that's under it and bring it into the house on Shabbos, unless you have a few conditions. Number one, that it has a opening from the dock to the house, and that way it makes it chayre reshus hayachid, which is that thing which we learned in Siman Hey. Number two, you also have to make a hole in the floor of this dock to be able to bring the water up. And number three, you have to make a wall. Now the wall could be, there's four ways of making this wall. It has to be yutfachim high above, around the whole gazuztara, around the hole, in which case it has to be at least 4 by 4 tfachim within this area where the box is, because then we consider that as its own reshus hayachid, and then we will say godachis, that the walls go down, up until we can look as if the walls go down. If it's above, we say as the walls go down, and it goes all the way down into the water, and then you're carrying from a reshus hayachid to a reshus hayachid, which is what's surrounded by a wall, and from there into the house is another reshus hayachid, so you don't have a problem. Obviously, we're talking that it's all owned by one person, not the water, but the dock and the house all owned by the same person. Or alternatively, you could do it under it, and then we will say godasik. Why does it? Now, in general, we would have a problem because these walls were not made for the river, but they were made for the gazuztara, and therefore, why do you think that these walls are going to have any effect on the water beneath it to be able to make it into a reshus hayachid? The answer is very simple, because you're making it specifically for the purpose of carrying water, only for carrying water, and therefore it's enough of a heker, and we were makel in this that it's considered, even though it was made on the gazuztara or below the gazuztara, it still works for the water, even though the walls are not going all the way down into the water. Now, like I said, there's four ways of doing it. The ones under it, we will say good achis going all the way up. Now, the problems that we have with this is, first of all, it's a mechitza shein and nikeres. How does it work with godasik, with godachis, there's gdoim boikim? Those are all the topics that we're going to discuss. These are discussed in different places in the Tzemach Tzedek and different places in the Alter Rebbe. There is a few things in the Tzemach Tzedek and a few things in the Kuntasach, and I'm going to mention them now one by one, just go through the Nekudas, so each one that is relevant to what we're learning. In Chidushim on Tzemach Tzedek on Maseches Eiroven Perik Ches, which is page 90 in your book. First, the Tzemach Tzedek over there explains, there's what Rabbeinu Yerucham says. The way it's understood from Rabbeinu Yerucham is an interesting lashon, that the mechitza that's made under, if you make the mechitza under the dock, it's around the hole, then it's also it's also stuck inside the hole, so it's visible. Essentially, it's visible. You say it's a mechitzot tluya, it's a hanging mechitza, and you could go under it, it's still mutter. Now, you have the problem of mechitzos she'eino nikaros, it's not visible. So he says like this: if the walls are on top of the around the hole on top of the gazuztara, then when you're standing, let's say you're in the water and you look up through the hole, you could see the walls. If you have them around the whole gazuztara, when you're in the water, you could also see them. Now obviously if it's below it, then if it's all around it, you could also see it. And if it's around the hole, you could also look and you could also see it. Now he does mention that there is a prima godim that says that by water we were makel, that gudachis helps even when it's not nikr. But the Tzemach Tzedek points out that even though the prima godim brings it as a svara, the prima godim stays in the tzarich chiyun. And therefore the Tzemach Tzedek pretty much seems like the Tzemach Tzedek says that the mechitzos have, if they're done below or they're done above, they have to be done in such a way that it's nikr. Ultimately, if it's completely not nikr, then you can't do it. So therefore, it seems like from the Tzemach Tzedek that these mechitzos should be done. The lashon of Tzemach Tzedek is eitzel hachoyer mamash. Mamash around the hole, that will be the best way to do it, because that way it is for sure nikr sai for the people below, sai for the people above. That is the Tzemach Tzedek that I pointed out in Chidush. Now let's go back to the Alter Rebbe. Alter Rebbe continues in Sif Aleph and says that obviously, which is something which you already said before, that if these mechitzos only work if they were done specifically for the purpose of carrying water, like we said, because then there is the issue of a heker. But if it was done for something else, then we cannot say gudachis. That's something which we're going to see later on in the Siman, that this idea also applies later on in the Siman, that if it was done for something else, there's no issue, that you can't say gudachis. Now it's interesting that even though Tzemach Tzedek goes into the whole issue of nikaros and not nikaros, Alter Rebbe Bichlal does not discuss nikaros, not nikaros. He focuses more on the heker that there is for these walls being specific for the water, and that is the main condition that is relevant. Now, being that you are allowed to take water out of through the hole, you're also allowed to pour water into the hole. You want to get rid of some water, you could also pour it into the hole. It should fall into the river. Now, what's going to happen? That once you pour it out, it's going to automatically go away. The river is flowing, it's not sitting in one place, and the water is going to flow out and move out of these four walls within this carmelis. It's not a problem, Alter Rebbe says, because einay miskavan lekach. You don't have an intention that it should go outside the mechitzos. What is your intention? Your intention is to get rid of it from your reshus hayachid. So what you want is to get rid of it from your house. You're pouring it into the hole, it's going into another reshus hayachid. It's going to move afterwards. That's not your intention. If it will be up to you. You still need all these things. Just like you could pour it, take it out, you could also pour in. Also with all these conditions, that it has the wall and everything else. What we're saying is we're not worried about hitzah, even though the water is without any, there's no way that the water is going to stay in one place. The fact is, we don't care, because in a miskavan, your goal is not to get it out of your property. It's not soya or something like that you want it completely away from your property, that you want it to flow out. It's just dirty water that, for whatever reason, you washed your floor, you had something you want to pour out down the sink. Nothing too extreme. For all you care, you don't mind if it's going, if that will stay. If lu yitzur, the walls will go all the way under and it would stay there, it wouldn't bother you. Now, in the next seif in Beis and on, the Alter Rebbe discusses various kinds of ships, big ships, small ships, that are connected to the sing. I'm not going to go into all the details of it. I want to actually focus on one point, which is in seif Daled. In seif Daled, the Alter Rebbe over there mentions towards the end of the seif that when you're on a ship, and we go through the conditions of the ship, if you want to pour water out, you have to make this board with a hole in it, similar to the Gazuztara, because the ship is a reshus hayachid, if it's a big enough ship. And over there, Alter Rebbe says that you could pour water from if you don't have this board that you want to use, bedugmas Gazuztara, that you hold outside the ship, and you want to pour water out, you cannot pour the water out directly into the sea, but you could pour into the river, but you could pour it on the side of the ship, which is Rishus HaYachid, and then from there it will roll over and go into the sea, and it's not a problem. Why? Because even though here your intention is that you do want it to go, there's no more the Eina Miskavan that we have in Sif Aleph. Over here is Miskavan, your Kavanah is to do it. But you're not doing it directly. All you're doing is you're pouring it onto the side, and from the side it's rolling by itself. So it's koichoi, it's not direct action, and koichoi we were not goizer in a karmelis, which is something which is going to come up in a few other places in Shulchan Aruch, that we were not goizer koichoi, legozer koichoi bekarmelis. In Seif Zayin, there's also, I'm jumping around, it's interesting, the topics I want to discuss. In Seif Zayin, it's talking about small ships, or it might even be bigger ships, but the bottom of the ship gets narrow to such a point that it's completely sharp in the bottom. It's not a flat bottom ship. It's shaped like a V, and it ends in a sharp bottom over there. And you don't have enough of a shear going up over there. So over there you don't have 4x4 on the bottom. So even if you have 10 tfachim going up on the walls of the ship, we still don't say good achis that the walls that are 10 tfachim high after the slope is over, we don't pull them back. Going down, and therefore you're not allowed to even carry inside this ship on Shabbos unless you make specific walls around the ship for Shabbos that are going, then you could use those as good achis. But the actual walls of the ship, if the bottom of it is shaped in such a way that it shapes all the way down to a very narrow kachudish or sakin, and there is no 4x4 tfachim on the bottom of the ship, then you can't carry on this. It's not Rishus HaYachid. It's big. You can't say it's Makom Torah.
The whole story is that's not allowed, so it should be Makom Torah.
Yeah, but the question is, could you pour from it or into it? Is it Rishus HaYachid? You can't carry in it.
I don't understand.
So what is the process? The question is, why can't we say good achis over here? Yeah, to make it. That's the discussion over here, is why can't you say good achis in such a scenario? Good achis would make sense to say, because technically you do have walls going up, tall walls around the ship. Why can't you say good achis in such a scenario? Then you have a short kuntesach and Alter Rebbe and kuntesach and Aleph. This is based on the shitta of Rav Huna, because we don't say good achis when we have goats going. We know that, it's a rule. We don't say good achis when b'kiyas g'doyim, when there's goats going under it. Over here you don't have goats swimming in the water, but you have fish. And according to Rav Huna, fish is also considered b'kiyah, similar to b'kiyas g'doyim, and therefore you can't say good achis, and you can't bring in water from that into there. The only heter of bringing water into this is when you have it through the gazuzotara, which is the gazuzotara's chayre Rishus HaYachid. Over here you don't have an original Rishus HaYachid to do it, so therefore you can't bring water from the Carmelis into this ship. And Alter Rebbe points out over here again that the reason why this is, well, the gazuzotara is a Rishus HaYachid, or all these scenarios, is simply because it's open, it has an opening, it has a door, it has a window to a Rishus HaYachid. That's the only reason why it is considered a Rishus HaYachid, but otherwise, despite the fact that it has the right size and the right dimensions of a Rishus HaYachid, it cannot be considered a Rishus HaYachid. Now, in Sif Yudin moves to the topic of Beis HaKisei. If you have a Beis HaKisei which is directly on top of the sea or on top of the river, then you have to have specific walls made for the purpose of the water to flow out. And therefore the only place to do it is under. Even though by regular gazuzotara you could put on top or you could put under, when it comes to Beis HaKisei, the only way it's going to work is if you put it under. Why? Because if you put it on top, it's obvious that the whole reason you did it is solely for the tznius, because nobody wants to, because a bathroom needs to have walls. And you don't have walls. You don't have walls. So the only way to do it with a heker that's specifically for the purpose of water flowing out is because of, is if you do it under it. And then we could say gudachis. Then the Alter Rebbe comes and pretty much throws everything off. Whatever we thought for the previous tense, if suddenly we have a big question. As min adin, the Alter Rebbe says, it doesn't make sense to say good achis even in the bathroom, even when the walls are built from the bottom. Why? Because as we said, we have the issue of g'dayim, baikim, bay, and the regular if it was done on top of earth. And over here you have the fish. So therefore, if we would look at it only mitzad din reshus hayachid, we would not say gudachis. The only reason why we look at the gazuztra as a reshus hayachid or as the beis hakeseh as a reshus hayachid is solely because it has chayre reshus hayachid, because it has a window open. But by its own definition, this is not considered a reshus hayachid. So why do we say that gudachis will work in this scenario for the purpose of the bathroom or for the purpose of bringing the water in? So ultimately you have the bekia of dagim, you have the fish going under it, and that is mevatel the gudachis, so you can't say gudachis. So Alter Rebbe here explains that you have basically two reasons. First one is the bekia of the fish is not visible like the bekia of g'dayim. That's number one. Number two, because, like we mentioned before, that the purpose of these walls is for the water, for carrying the water, and not for the purpose of tiltul. Therefore, these walls serve as a heker that the water is a carmelis, and without it you would not be able to carry. But it gives you a reminder, this water is not reshus hayachid, this water is a carmelis, and you have to be careful. The only way you're able to do it, and the Chachamim were mekel, and the same Chachamim that were oiser regarding a carmelis, they were mekel in such a scenario when you make specific walls that are done as a heker, then it works. But therefore, he says, even though min adin would not work, the Chachamim gave you a special kula in such a scenario. But if the mechitza was not made specifically for it, then it can't work. And that is the explanation why by a bathroom with the mechitza on top, it doesn't work. And this, the Alter Rebbe explains also in Kuntre Sachren over here. The Alter Rebbe goes into it when the Alter Rebbe, we mentioned, and in Kuntre Sachren, the first Kuntre Sachren, Alter Rebbe explains that the gazuztara is only reshus hayachid because of the window and not because of its dimensions, and we can't say gudachis, and we can't use the regular walls of it because of the bekias g'dayim. And the Alter Rebbe also explains that midei raise, if we look at this gazuztara that has no mechitzos, if it would not have a window or a door into the reshus hayachid, then we would not be able to consider it a reshus hayachid. This gazuztara would be considered this gazuztara midei raise would be considered a carmelis midei raise, not a reshus hayachid midei raise. This is a big machlekes in machlekes Rashi Tosfos. It's a machlekes we'll discuss later. But this is a carmelis. The Alter Rebbe explains this is a carmelis gemura midei raise, not a carmelis midei rabbanon, which is really reshus hayachid. And therefore, midei raise, you would be able to carry within a carmelis. If it's a carmelis deraisa, you could carry in it, and you could carry from the carmelis deraisa, which is the gazuztara, to a carmelis deraisa, which is the river. But you would not be able to carry from this carmelis deraisa to a house, which is a reshus hayachid. But now that this became, so this is midiraisa as a carmelis. So the only way to convert into reshus hayachid is when you have an opening, or when you have a door, or when you have a window that's leading from the house into it. Then it becomes into a reshus hayachid. Now, once that converts from a carmelis into reshus hayachid, that's why you need the walls around it, because otherwise you cannot carry from the water, which is a carmelis, into this gazuztara, which is now a reshus hayachid. And the mechitzos have to be, like we said before, specifically designated for the purpose of doing the water, because otherwise there's a special kula that we have regarding carrying the water as a special heker, because otherwise this mechitzus technically min adin would not help at all. In Seif Yud Aleph, Alter Rebbe moves on to the same, continues.
Once you make a char, it's only a kamazava.
What?
Once you make a char to the shachayachid, so then it's considered...
Kamas Rabban, it's Reshus Hayachid Midiraisa.
Yeah.
It's fully Reshus Hayachid Midiraisa. But how are you going to carry from the water into there? You can't bring the water. You can't carry the water into it. That's why you have to make the walls around it. But before that, Midiraisa you would be able to carry from the gazuztara to the river and from the river to the gazuztara, but not into the house. But the whole purpose is you're not interested in bringing the water onto the gazuztara. You're not sitting on the gazuztara without any walls and having a Shabbos meal over there with people could fall off the gazuztara. The whole purpose is that you want to have it inside the house. So if you want to have it inside the house, you have to make the walls around it. In Seif Yud Aleph, the Alter Rebbe discusses about if you have that if a Beis HaKisei and the tzoya doesn't fall directly into the water, rather it falls first, touches something which is a Reshus Hayachid, which is already in Reshus Hayachid, so it goes from Reshus Hayachid to a Reshus Hayachid, and then it continues flowing into the outside, then you don't need these walls around it. Why? Because it's koichai, and we were not goizer koichai in a carmelis. And Alter Rebbe throws a comment, this all applies in a carmelis, mechutz la'ir, like I will explain in Siman Shin Zayin. What is explained in Siman Shin Zayin? A carmelis mechutz la'ir, what's the idea of mechutz la'ir? In Siman Shin Zayin, if Zayin Alter Rebbe over there discusses, the whole Siman over there discusses about pouring water to a chatzar, which is samuch to a reshus harabim. When is it a problem to pour water into your chatzar? When it's going to flow further? When is it not a problem to pour water into your chatzar if it's going to flow to go further? And if it's a small chatzar, it's completely asur to pour water from your house into your own personal chatzar, which is a reshus hayachid, because it's for sure going to flow into a reshus harabim. And over there, the Alter Rebbe says in Seif Zayin that if the chatzar is not samuch to reshus harabim, it's rather samuch to a carmelis that is inside the city, then you're allowed to pour as much as you want, because we were not goizer koichai in carmelis. That is the first opinion. Alter Rebbe then says, no, yeshayim, it's not so. There is no difference between the reshus hayachid and the carmelis when it comes to this idea. Because this idea of that legazru koichai becarmelis only applies to rivers and bodies of water. That those are a specific form of carmelis, that nobody's going to ever mix them up with a carmelis, which is a walking carmelis, and get mixed up with reshus harabim. The whole idea of not carrying the carmelis midirabanan is because of Shema Yitu. So if you're talking about a river or a sea, that's a kind of carmelis that nobody's going to make a mistake and mix it up for a reshus harabim. But if it's or a carmelis outside the city, where nobody's going to also think that it's like a reshus harabim. Why outside the city nobody's going to think? Because there's no derech rabim to hang out in carmelises which are outside the city. Shiur b'kiyas rabim b'reshus harabim gemura. You don't have the shiur b'kiyas rabim in the carmelis outside the city. But when you have a carmelis inside the city, the shit of the yeshayim is that it does get. People could mix that up like a reshus harabim. Even bisman hazeh that we say that there's no reshus harabim because ein shishim riboy boikim ba, that there's no 600,000 people going through this reshus harabim. Why is it still asur by a carmelis inside the city? Because it gets converted, it gets mixed up. Be'ir gdoila sheyesh ba shishim riboy. In a big city which does have shishim riboy. So here, just as a side note, you have a seif where the Alter Rebbe mentions sai the ir sheyesh ba shishim riboy, and sai that shishim riboy ba inside on this actual place. So this is where the people always discuss whether the Alter Rebbe held 600,000 people on the street or 600,000 people in the city. Huh? Shinun Zayin, Seif Zayin. Yeah, you could, and you could, like I told you in the past, if you want to hold that it's 600,000 people dafka in a city and not in the street, then you'll explain it to fit this way. And if you want to hold the other way, that it's 600,000 in a street and not in a city, you could explain this to fit the other way. And the market isla, each person, whichever political position he wants to take, that's how he will fit the Alter Rebbe to fit his position. But I'm just pointing out, this is one of the places where Ir is mentioned, not the only place, but in Shin and Zayin it's mentioned. Alter Rebbe continues over there, that the difference between that case, where by pouring into a Carmelis from your house, from a Chatzah, which is some of the Carmelis, and the Din of Gazuztara, which is what we learn in the Siman which we're discussing now, Siman Shin and Hey, is by Gazuztara. What's the reason why you're allowed to pour into the Yam? Is because Ein Miskaven, which is the idea which we mentioned already in Shin and Hey. But over here in Shin and Zayin, what's the reason why you're pouring it into your chatzar? Obviously, because you want a small chatzar. We're talking about a very small chatzar that cannot handle all the water that you're pouring. It's obvious that you want to pour it out, so it should go out of your chatzar. Since the idea is mechavan that you want to go outside your chatzar, so you can't compare it to gazuztara and say that loy gazrin koichay, but rather koichay bekarmelis. Aside from the fact that it doesn't apply in the karmelis inside the city, but only the Carmelis outside the city, or a Carmelis like a river or water that can't get mixed up. It's also over here you have a kavan, and therefore it's also according to the Yeshayim. And Alter Rebbe says in the shit of the Yeshayim, v'chein ikar. That is the main opinion. This is what the Alter Rebbe should design. And that is what's connected to Sifid Alpha. The Alter Rebbe says that the Carmelis that we're discussing over here is only Carmelis mechutz, which is based on the Shitta of the Yeshayim and the Siman Shin and Zayin, that the Alter Rebbe says that v'chein ikra. Siftas vav in this Siman Shin and Hey, the Alter Rebbe points out, we're discussing this whole idea of mechitsot luya, etc. He says that it works under the water or above the water. Alter Rebbe says obviously this only applies when you have when there is no bekias rabim under this area, because that way we could say there's no bekias people bichlal. There's no drisa saregel in the water under it. Whether it's deep or it's not deep, the pile people are not going under it. But if it's water that people do go under it, do go in it, do cross it, whether it's deeper than the shear, it's not comfortable, whatever it is, then a mechitsot luya wouldn't work, even if it's deeper than 10, even if it's in the Carmelis. Why? Because bekias of people does cause damage to the good achis, and there's no more good achis. The same thing is, if the water dries up, if it's a dry riverbed, you also have a problem. You can't say good achis because people do walk through it. And that's what Alter Rebbe says. The same would apply if the water froze, which we learned already that the Alter Rebbe shitta is that by freezing water we don't look at it as what it would be when it would melt, but rather at the status of it right now, that since it's easy to walk through it, so the fact that there used to be water there that flows, if right now people are going through it, that completely gets rid of the good achis. Now, why is it that we are worried about the good, that we say that bekias, that people going through drisas anoshim is mevatel the good achis? Now we know that to convert, that to be mevatel mechitzos, if we're not discussing good achis, mevatel mechitzos, you need to have bekias rabim, shishim riboy, whatever it is. Why over here is different? This Alter Rebbe discusses in Kuntas Achron Sif Gimel on this Siman. Over here it says that even if you're going to say people do go through it, but it's not Eirishus Sarabim Gemura, he says, L'cha'ira, according to logic, if the water is not Eirishus Sarabim Gemura, we should be able to be Mekel in the Mechizat Luya. Why? Because Bekias Rabim is Shishim Riboy, not Stam. The Alter Rebbe says, Zeh, Avol Zeh. No, you can't say such a logic. Rather, every kind of Bekia cancels good achis, even if there is no Shishim Riboy. Just like by goats. By goats, we don't say that you need 60 riba goats to be mevatel gud achis. We say b'kiyas g'dayim. Not only that, b'kiyas g'dayim applies even in a churve shebekarmelis, some abandoned, broken garmelis, and over there also we still say b'kiyas g'dayim cancels the mechitzos. We say mechitzat tluya doesn't work. And even in Eretz Yisrael, where there's an issur to megadl behema dakas atayas, so really there should be no goats in Eretz Yisrael. Still we say b'kiyas g'dayim, even though there's no goats technically speaking. So therefore the Alter Rebbe says it's not about the goats, it's not about the people, it's not about the numbers, it's about, it's a din in the place, that the place is goyim what the status of it should become. Basically, if G'dayim technically could go by it, whether there are G'dayim in town or there are no G'dayim in town, that's not the point. The point is if G'dayim could walk through it, the only reason why G'dayim are not going through it is because of Meniah for a different reason. For whatever reason, whether because there's water there, because it's cold, because G'dayim are not in town, whatever reason is, the fact is G'dayim could go through it, then the Bekia is mevatel the gud achis. That means as long as the way, the mokim is goyim, that it could have Bekias G'dayim, that's already enough that the mechitza tluya will not have any effect. And the same, and if it's by G'dayim, so how much more so by Adam? If people could go by it, then, and we see that people go by it, then it's a problem. Even if actually people don't go through it. The fact is, could be that you have mechitza tluya in an area where people are not going to go through it because of whatever reason, it's a dangerous neighborhood or whatever it is, it's too cold. Still, we still say bekia. Elamai, by water, the mokim is goydem that there are no goats, and the mokim is goydem that there are no people going through there. So therefore, the original, the first thought is that you don't have there is no bekia, and therefore we could be meko. However, if b'poil we see that there is bekia, then we're not going to start saying, oh, we need 600,000 people like Kedusha Serabim. It's obvious, Alter Rebbe says, pshita, that it's mevatel completely the good achis. And now, even if you're going to come and you're going to say that you do need shishim riba in such a thing, he says the meniah would not be because of the place. That means the place technically could handle shishim riba, it could walk through this area. So we're back to the same spot that we started before. This place could handle shishim riba going through it. They'll walk in a straight line, there'll be shishim riba being bekeah through it. The fact is they're not. What's the issue why there is not? Because there's no 600,000 people in the city. Again, this Kuntas Achan also mentions the city. And then the Alter Rebbe points out that Bichlal, the whole idea of Shishim Ribai, you should just know that it doesn't apply across the board to everything. It's only the Shishim Ribai in the city, and again the Alter Rebbe mentions city, is only relevant when we're discussing whether this place has a category of Rosh Hashanah, doesn't have Rosh Hashanah. And over here, we're not discussing whether this area under the Gazuztara is this water area, is it a Rosh Hashanah or not? We know it's not a Rosh Hashanah. The only thing we're trying to figure out is whether it is a Rosh Hashanah or not. So the din over here is not yet Rosh Hashanah, not Rosh Hashanah. Therefore, the 600,000 people in the city bears no relevance to here. Over here, the question is it Rosh Hashanah or it's not Rosh Hashanah? So if it has the mechitzos and there's no bekia, there's no drissas anoshim, then it's a Rosh Hashanah. Once you have a drissas anoshim, I don't care how many people it is. The fact is that people do go through it, then it loses the status of a Rosh Hashanah, and that's the only thing that we care about when we're discussing good achis, and therefore there is no good achis. However, good achis is different than good asik, that in good asik, even if you have shishim ribai mideirais, it's not mevatel the mechitza. Only chachamim were oiser up to shishim ribai, up to shishim ribai mevatel the mechitza. Even if it's a mechitza b'dei shamayim mideirais, you don't have the problem of even shishim are not mevatlot, and therefore And therefore, if it's less than shishim riboy, and if it's less than shishim riboy and you have a good asik, then the Alter Rebbe says that we're not going to be oiser even midirabanan. Means we're not going to add a chumrah into the rabbanan. It's an interesting call of the Alter Rebbe in this Kuntasachin. We're not going to add a chumrah more than what the Chachamim did. The Chachamim midiraisa even more than shishim riboy doesn't dissolve good asik. Chachamim more than shishim riboy dissolves good asik. But less than shishim riboy, we're not going to say that good asik gets cancelled, even midirabanan. But that's all relevant to good asik. Comes to good achis, we already discussed it. Good achis, even the goats could do it. We do see that there is that good asik does get cancelled when people go through it. Even midirabanan, that applies to not a mechitza that people walk by it. It applies to mechitza nidresses, that it's completely trampled on by people, and nichot hashmishtei, and therefore in such a scenario, it's nichot hashmishtei, then we do say good asik. Now, there's another few points that are relevant. Before I get to the bridge, I want to discuss there's an interesting tzemach tzedek in Chidushim, on Maseches Shabbos, Perek Yud Aleph, Mishnah Beis, which is page 83 in your book. The reason it's interesting is because the tzemach tzedek, which when you read it, when you learn it, it looks like the tzemach tzedek is basically coming to explain and support and discuss the understanding of the biur agra in the Shulchan Aruch. Quotes him 3-4 places. So when it comes to gazuztara, we know we have the halacha and Siman Shimam Hey, that, and that's we already know also over here in Shin Nun Hey, that when you have the zizim haboiltim in a kaisel, or similar to gazuztara, that you have, and it's sticking out of a reshus hayachid. It has the din of a karmelis unless there is an opening from a reshus hayachid, which then makes it into choyrei reshus hayachid. The tzemach tzedek then presents that it looks like from Rashi, that Rashi holds that the moment it has the right dimensions, it is considered a reshus hayachid, even if it has no mechitzos, even if it does not have an opening to it. But rather, mitzad atzmei, the mere fact that it has the right size already makes it into a reshus hayachid. Tosfos is the one that holds that you need a open window to it, and you have the issue of g'dayim baikim under it, and therefore you don't have good achas. But from Rashi, it seems that from Rashi, in a few places, it seems that he holds that we're not worried about good achas in such a scenario, and we don't need the chayre reshus hayachid, we don't need the opening to reshus hayachid, but it's a reshus hayachid by its own definition. And then Tzemach Tzedek points out that is how the Gra understood it in Siman Shin Mem Hey, and in Siman Shin Mem Gimel in 2 places, and the Tzemach Tzedek then points out that one of the places in Shin Mem Gimel, the Gra says that it's also Shit of the Rambam, but it's not so clear it's Shit of the Rambam. We're going to get to it in a second. But then the question is, how could Rashi hold such a thing? You want to say that completely eliminates the concept of B'kiyas G'dayim? How could that be? It's and we see by a traskel that's standing in the Reshus Harabim that we don't say good achis because of G'dayim Boikim Boy. So how? And over there Rashi doesn't disagree with it. So why by gazuztara, by zizim, we do hold it? So Tzemach Tzedek says, l'chayre, the shit of Rashi is, by a traskel you don't have any walls other than the good achis. It's hanging in the middle of Reshus Harabim. So therefore, you cannot say that it's under it as a reshus hayachid. But over here in the ziz or gazuztara, it's not all 4 are good achis. Rather, 3 are good achis. You don't need 3, you need 2 and a bit. But only 3 are good achis, because 1 is the wall of the house. Sai by gazuztara, it's underwater. Sai by gazuztara, that's under reshus harabim. Sai by gazuztara, sai by ziz, by all of them. Zizim haboiltim. They all have 1 wall. It's not hanging in the air. It's connected to a house, and therefore it has the wall of a house on one side, which means that you're not relying solely on good achis. You're relying on good achis together with with something else. And therefore, that is why Rashi in these scenarios holds that gudachis that is connected to that has one wall of the house together with it, does not get completely cancelled if it has all the tanoim of a reshus hayachid. That means all the tanoim means it has the right size, dimensions of it. And then yeah. And over there, the Tzemach Tzedek then points out, happens to be, he says, the Gra says that that's how the Rambam also holds, the Gra and Shin Nun Gimel. But the Tzemach Tzedek says, on this point, you can't say clearly that the Rambam would hold completely like Rashi. There's a certain difference between the Rambam and the Rashi, but according to Rashi, we must say it that way. And then he says, maybe we could bring a proof to Rashi from Rabbeinu Yerucham, because Rabbeinu Yerucham holds that by a gazuztara on top of water, you don't need a opening to reshus hayachid to make it a reshus hayachid. And the Tzemach Tzedek says, no, it's not enough of a right to Rashi, because according to Rashi, like we said before, we could say that B'kiyas G'dayim completely doesn't eliminate gudachis. Rather it still remains a reshus hayachid on top of it. But according to Rabbeinu Yerucham, only on top of water it doesn't eliminate it. Maybe Rabbeinu Yerucham has a different shit in it. But you can't say that Rabbeinu Yerucham supports Rashi on this matter. And the Tzemach Tzedek says, so what is the logic of Rashi? Because we mentioned before that the difference in a traskel and a ziz and gazuztara is that you have one wall. So what is the difference between the two? So he says, could be Rashi's mekel, because ultimately, what does it help us that we have one wall? One real wall together with gudachis. Why are the G'dayim not mevatel the gudachis completely in such a scenario? He says, could be Rashi's shita is that ultimately, this wall is blocking the B'kiyas G'dayim, at least on one side. So the B'kiyas G'dayim seems like, the Tzemach Tzedek understands that Rashi's category of B'kiyas G'dayim is that the G'dayim have full range to roam without hitting any walls while they're running around all these walls. But the moment they're going to hit a wall, trying to get from one way to another, you don't have any more the concept of B'kiyas G'dayim, which completely cancels Gudachis, and therefore it would be a problem. Therefore, it wouldn't be a problem according to Rashi. That is essentially what's relevant to this Siman. There is a tshuva from the Tzemach Tzedek, which I mentioned to you to learn, which is in Siman Lametes, which discusses a bridge that goes over a city. The reason why I'm discussing it now, because it does have certain discussions about it, and all the concepts which are going to be discussed in this tshuva, we learned to most of those simanim already. There's one Siman Shinayim Beis, that we did not learn yet, but I didn't find the right place where to stick this tshuva, and I think it's very important, so I decided to stick it here where I found some connection to the Siman, but it's not directly connected to the Siman, it's more, if it will be connected specifically to certain Siman, it will be connected more to Siman Shinayim Beis, but the concepts are relevant over here also. The tshuva is Erechaim Siman Lametes, which is page 18 in your book. What are we talking about over there? The tziyur, what the scenario over there was, there was a city which had a river going through it, separating the two sides of the city. Many cities were built on two sides of the river. You could look at New York, for example. Okay, Manhattan is an island, but Brooklyn has rivers going through it. You go to Williamsburg, separating between Brooklyn and going up towards Queens. You go in Europe, many cities have London, Budapest, Warsaw, Rostov, a lot of cities had rivers. Moscow has a bunch of them that had rivers separating two sides of the city, and this built up from both sides. And there is a bridge that goes from one side of the city to the other side of the city. The bridge is wider than 10 amas, more than the pirza. And the questions were, does one side, it looks like from the tshuva, it's not clearly written, but it looks like one side of the city was able to make an eruv, and they relied on the walls of the river on that one side, and another 3 walls, and then you had a bridge that goes from the river to the other side. So the question was, you have a big pirza wider than 10, does this whole side of the city, which has the river going over the water, does it cancel the hekef? And it's part of its b'milui to this place which is asur, and therefore the whole city is eruv is cancelled. That's question number one. Question number two, could you carry bichlal on this bridge? So the Tzemach Tzedek first starts by bringing a Mishnah, that's the din which is discussed in Siman Shinai Beis, that when you have a chotzer which has in between it a ditch, and the ditch is 4 wide, 10 deep, so it's got all the conditions to separate the two reshuyos, and over there every chotzer is considered its own chotzer on the two sides of the ditch, and they cannot make one joint eruv for both together because they have a ditch in between. Each side has to make their own eruv chatzeres. You have a chotzer on one side, chotzer on the other side. However, the Mishnah says, if you put a plank of wood, which is 4 tfachim wide, that goes from side to side, then it's like somewhat of a bridge, and it's considered an opening from one reshus to the other reshus, from one chotzer to the other chotzer. It's 4 tfachim wide, it goes over this ditch. Then they could decide what they want to do. Either they could make an eruv on each side, or they can make one joint eruv between the two, because this plank is considered like a pesach, an opening in this ditch, and you could go from one to another. And if it's less than 4 tfachim wide, then it's not enough to be considered a pesach, and each side has to do its own eruv. Tzemach Tzedek says, good, this Mishnah is great, yeah, but this Mishnah doesn't discuss what happens if it's wider than 10 amas. What happens if it's wider than 10 amas? Yeah, if it's long, 11 amas long, and it's open. Yeah, it doesn't have walls on the two sides. So now you have, we'll call it a 10 amas wide, it's a gap. It's a pirza, more than 10 amas. Do we still say that each side could make its own eruv? Or do we say that it's partos b'miloi one to another, and completely partos from one side to the other side, and therefore you cannot make two eruv chatzeres. You must make one that connects the two, because they're completely considered like one. Yeah, because like we said, you have a pirza between the two, which is 10 amas wide. Just like when you have 2 chatzeres and there's an opening in the wall between the two, which has 10 amas wide, which is a halacha we already learned before, that these 2 chatzeres become like one. You can only do one. That's what Tzemach Tzedek says. Maybe you can make a difference between, you could differentiate between the two. By a wall, what happens when you have a wall that falls down? You have no more mechitza left between the two. All you have right now is a full opening, the 2 chatzeres get completely combined. Over here, by this ditch, the ditch still exists. You have an opening on top of the ditch. The wall of the ditch still exists, just we eliminated it. We don't look at it now. But the wall is still there. If the wall is still there, why do you say, maybe it's different, and we will say that you still won't consider it as completely parts one to another, and you could make an eruv on each side. Now just before we continue, the idea behind it is just got to figure out if this bridge that's wide 10 amas considers it a pirza that you cannot do anything about other than a tikkun, or it's lav dafka pirza. If we, based on this chiluk, we're going to say maybe the walls of the river under it still exist. So maybe it's like a neser. If we're going to say that this plank of wood, if it's 10 amas wide, it's not like a kaisel, it's not like a wall which completely eliminates the mechitza, but it has a separate din because the charetz is still there. By a river, the same thing would apply. And then we're going to say gudasik to the walls of the river. So he says, no, that can't work. Why? Because mechitzas are not nikr. The concept that we learned why the mechitzas is not nikr? When you're standing on the plank, you don't see the mechitzah which is under it. So you can't say gudasik. You can't say gudasik when the mechitzah is completely not nikr. It's completely covered by it. Like what? Like when you have which we learned the shim earlier in Shimon. Hey, when you have a boir, when you have a pit which is filled with peiros, not with water, then we don't say gudasik. Why? Because the mechitzas are completely not nikr. And the Tzemach Tzedek proves it from the tshuvas of the Chacham Tzvi, and from Hilchas Sukkah, and from Hilchas Eirovin. over there, and he also says that the Chasam Sofer, who discusses such a scenario, explains why it would need some kind of a tikkun. What the tikkun will be, we'll soon see. That is the beginning of the Tzemach Tzedek. Then yeah. I wouldn't quote him if he's not mentioned there. I'm saying I wouldn't quote him as part of the tshuva if he's not mentioned. I would quote him afterwards. In the tshuva, he goes back and forth in the Chasam Sofer. Then the Tzemach Tzedek goes in the second in his base, and he says that maybe we could, it brings from one of the Rishonim, we could make a difference between Sukkah and Shabbos. You can't say by Sukkah we say that Mechitza Shein Nikeres is no good asik. Well, maybe by Shabbos you could say that. Why? Because by a Sukkah, in Mechitzas that are Nicker, because the Mechitzas that are Nicker and visible, because a Sukkah is like a house. And by a house you have to have visible walls. But by Eirovin, maybe you don't need that's visible. It's all enough, it's Nikares, that's recognizable. Mechitza ha-Nikeres, not Niras Ima, just Nikeres, it's recognizable that there is. When you stand on a plank, you don't see it. But you see, when you stand right next to the plank, you do see that there is a wall going under it. So it's Nikar, but it's not Nira. So that maybe does work by Eirovin. And he says that it's not so. Tzemach Tzedek explains over there at length why it's not so. And even by Shabbos, you need mechitzas which are Nikar and visible to the person when he's standing on top of the plank. And all without that, you don't have good asik. Now, just to point out, an interesting thing, in Divrei Nehemiah, in the Biurim that he has to the Alter Rebbe, Siman Shimem Hey Seif Gimel, which is page 125 in your white book, over there he also goes into the whole explanation why you cannot make a difference between Sukkah and Shabbos, and he says quite strongly that Lekuli Alma, you can't say good asik unless you have another point he points out over there. You can't say good asik unless you have mechitzas mamish that are there under the plank. And then we say that the good asik goes if the walls go all the way up. And then if you have mechitzas mamish, you have the ditch is also mechitzas mamish. It's visible. Then there's a machlekes in nikares, not nikares, a machlekes in Gemara, we pass that it is nikares. But if you don't have mamish mechitzas from it, you can't say bichlal good asik, and you can't make a difference between Sukkah and Shabbos. That's just pointing out to you the Divrei Nehemiah. I didn't go into details, just pointing out to you if you want to learn it a little bit deeper, you can go over there also. As the Tzemach Tzedek doesn't mention the Divrei Nehemiah, but he mentions this concept, you can't make a differentiation between Shabbos and Sukkah. And the Tzemach Tzedek says maybe we could make a different difference, that Echaretz is different, because it's not kavua. The Tzemach Tzedek continues that from the Taz it's mashma that if you have up until 10 amas, it does work. But more than 10, it doesn't work because it becomes a pirtze. That's how the Pri Megadim understands the Taz. The Tzemach Tzedek says we have a problem. The Alter Rebbe in Sim Shinayim Beis didn't mention this condition of the Taz that's only up to 10 amas. But he just says, stam. And therefore, maybe the Alter Rebbe doesn't hold that it's only up to 10 amas and more than 10 amas is a pirtze. Doesn't hold like the Taz. And rather, maybe the Alter Rebbe holds that good asik by such a scenario will continue. Yeah. And Tzemach Tzedek says, okay, maybe we could still argue that there's a difference between something which is permanent and something which is not permanent. This plank over it is not permanent. And then the Tzemach Tzedek says, okay, all this does work by a plank, even according to the ones that will hold by a plank is not a problem, because he's medayek from the Alter Rebbe that will hold by a plank is not a problem, good asik is not cancelled. Tzemach Tzedek continues in Ois Gimel that by a bridge it will be cancelled. Why? Because a bridge is permanent. Based on this nekuda that Tzemach Tzedek mentioned twice already in Ois Aleph and in Ois Beis, that permanent is different than temporary. And by a bridge you have a problem. Because it's permanent, going on top of it. So the Kuli Alma, it is mevatel, the mechitza of the nahar, which is under the bridge, that it's no longer good asik. Why? Because once it's permanent, there's no longer mechitza hanikeres. Not only that, mechitza hanikeres, maybe it's even mechitza hanidreses, that it gets stepped on. And therefore you cannot say good asik. And therefore up until 10 amas, you could say that it's an opening and not a pirtze, and therefore it's not nesbatel. But anything more than that, more than 10 amas, it is mevatel the mechitzas. under the bridge. If you have it on top of the bridge, you solve all the problems. And he says that the Neder Behuda held that way, and therefore the Neder Behuda says you have to make a Tzuras HaPesach on the bridge for that reason. Yeah, so you have to be able to save the city, you have to make a Tzuras HaPesach. Now the Tzemach Tzedek continues and says, what about carrying on the bridge itself? Yeah, because it's clear that if it's that you need, it's mevatel the mechitz is under it. But what about the bridge itself? Does the Tzuras HaPesach Bechlal help? What the Gesher, this bridge, is not Mukaf L'Dira. If it's bigger than Beis Hasayim, it's not Mukaf L'Dira. Could be that its length and its width is going to be in a situation that's going to be a karfaf that you can't help. It might become a karfaf. So even though Tzuras HaPesach will save the city, who says that you could carry on the bridge? Let's say you have on two sides of the city, you put two Tzuras HaPesach, what's going to happen on the bridge? Could you carry on the bridge itself? So he says that we could argue there's a tzad kula in the bridge, and this is even though we say that a bridge is not hokaf l'dira. So Tzedek is a very interesting chiddush, a diuk in Alter Rebbe. This only will apply in a bridge that leads from the city to outside the city. But if it's a bridge that goes inside, inter-city bridge that has houses on one side and houses on the other side, and people go back and forth the whole time, and they go from side to side, that in itself makes it a beis dira. Why? Because what's the lashon of the Alter Rebbe in Shin and Ches? Kol hekef mechitzus v'lo hukaf l'diras adam leknisa v'yitzia tamid, for constant entering and exiting. Which means the Tzedek is medayik that shaloi hukaf l'diras adam leknisa v'yitzia tamid means that even if the only thing it was hukaf for is for knisa v'yitzia tamid and nothing more than knisa v'yitzia tamid, just to cross over it, it already becomes hukaf l'dira, and therefore this bridge, even though it has no other use other than knisa v'yitzia tamid, it's already enough that it's no longer considered a karfuf, and therefore that Tzemach Tzedek says the Tzuras HaPesach will for sure help in such a scenario. Why? Because it's inside the city. But still you need Tzuras HaPesach more than 10 amas, like we said before. And Tzemach Tzedek says that Chasam Sofer brings another two kulas, and he says why the two kulas are not good. With that he concludes. He says the first kula is Tzemach Tzedek was mekel in his own bridge in the city because there's different kinds of bridges, and sometimes you look, there's bridges which are along the same height as the street. So the street goes, and they built a bridge which you don't feel that you're going over the water. It just continues the same height as the streets. But Chasam Sofer says it could be mekel. Why? Because the bridge starts going on a strong slope going up before the bridge, and it's mislaket. And therefore the Chasam Sofer said you could be mekel in his scenario. Tzemach Tzedek says over here it doesn't apply because over here the bridge goes straight line with the water. The second thing that Chasam Sofer says another kula is that if you look in the middle of the river, it's mislaket. Maybe not by the edge of the river, but further down towards the middle of the river, there is mislaket. So you have the bridge, so you have mislaket under the bridge, and we're going to say gudasik all the way up. So it will split. It will become that the bridge is closed. Yeah, so then the bridge is closed from all sides. Mitzad echad, it's in the city and it's closed. From the other side, you have the walls of the river that are under the bridge go all the way up, and they become gudasik, and they cover that. Tzemach Tzedek says that wouldn't help because it has much more than 10 amas from where it starts to mislaket all the way to go up. From the mislaket all the way to where the bridge is, you have much more than 10 amas. You have a pirtza from the mislaket, says anyway, it's not going to help you anything. So a good asik won't help. More so, there's no mechitzus nikaris, therefore you can't say good asik. Therefore, Tzemach Tzedek says you do need a Tzuras HaPesach. Just interesting to note, I did see a Shas Tshuvas Imre Yoisher from Meir Arik Chelik Aleph Siman Beis that he doesn't quote Tzemach Tzedek. He usually does quote the Alter Rebbe and other things, but in this scenario, this tshuva, interestingly, he discusses a topic similar to the Tzemach Tzedek and ends up with the same conclusion, understanding the Rishonim the same way that Tzemach Tzedek understands it and coming to Maskana coming to maskana the same way as the Tzemach Tzedek came to Maskana. With that, we will conclude.